Thanks, Mark. Good morning. Oh, goodness. I feel like I should throw out some random phrases that can be sampled well into the remix afterwards. So I'm going to just have some random non sequiturs throughout the whole thing. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to Mark for inviting me to be at Beyond Tellerrand. It's one of my really favorite events, and to be here is really quite an honor. Yes, I'm a typeface designer, and kind of, I'd say that I'm an inventor, except for Seb's far cooler stuff we've just seen involving lasers and things like that. But I design typefaces, and I do a little bit of code, and I write a lot of words. And about 25 years ago, I opened my company to specialize in making typefaces, not to recreate old ones, but to design new ones, to basically to use myself when I was doing graphic design work. Over the past couple of decades, this has sort of been an expanded mission, not just to make typefaces, but to create services that allow people to use them in various ways, the web being the most recent one for us. I feel like I'm in an unusual situation today in that I can talk to people who are technologists as well as designers, and can confess that I came to typography through computers. I grew up with the Commodore family of computers. There was a Commodore PET in my 4th grade classroom. I had a VIC-20 and a Commodore 64 at home. And actually, one of the first pieces of software that I wrote was a font editor, which did these, as you can see, very sophisticated and high-resolution things in an 8x8 matrix. So these days, the typefaces that I draw aren't made of pixels, they're made of outlines. But the web, of course, has brought me and the designers I work with full circle back to thinking about outlines and what happens to them when they're reduced to pixel grids. This is an example of the instructions that you add to that drawing of a fist to tell it how to reduce itself to a different pixel grid. And of course, you need to do this for every possible size. And in many ways, this is kind of the philosophy of responsive design at work, not applied to web grids, but applied to alphabets. You're telling a typeface how to present itself in different circumstances. As a result of that, a lot of the people in our team are very hard to identify in terms of one thing that they do. There are type designers. This is Andy Clymer, who's our senior designer. He's been here about 9 years. And as you can see from what Andy's doing right now, he's drawing a typeface, but he's also making a tool to help aid in the design of that typeface. Tool development and type development really go hand in hand in the work that we do. And this is Sarah Siskolny, another of our designers, who's working on a project that involves internationalization. So she's thinking about letters in terms of not just drawings, but parts of somebody else's language. There are 18 of us at the company, of whom 12 are not type designers. And one of the things that I'm most proud of is the way we work together as a team. This is Brandon Durham, our head of web development, who's also a user of the typefaces. He wouldn't style himself a designer, but he's an excellent typographer. And he's always one of the first to use our web fonts in personal projects. So if you keep an eye on Brandon's work, you'll see things we have in the pipeline sneaking out to the public slowly. I'm very grateful to have someone like Brandon who's able to not just build the things we make, but advocate them from a user's perspective. He actually uses the things and is able to really offer interesting feedback based upon that. And this is Brian Hennings, our design director, working on artwork for a thing we launched earlier this year called Discover Typography. I wanted to capture this moment because Brian has Illustrator open in the background, but Git open in the foreground, which is kind of odd for a graphic designer. I mean, he comes from a print tradition and is now thinking more about process than about the design of the surface thing itself. So 5 years ago, we began the journey toward making web fonts. Mark asked me to come and talk about that, and what I thought I'd do instead is not just talk about the work that we've done, but the things we've learned, things that I think might be a useful foundation for anybody thinking about web fonts and choosing them, certainly, which I hope you find useful. So web fonts have a longer history than we all think. They debuted in 1997 with IE4. Perhaps the last time that IE and web fonts ever appeared in the same sentence. A decade later, we had CSS support, and a few years later, the first web font services. And about 5 years ago, I had a conversation with a kind of booster for Webfonts who said this to me with great enthusiasm. Let's put Hepler fonts on the web. And I love the web as a medium. I spend most of my time on the web designing for it and writing for it and using it, of course. And I love the idea of developing fonts for the web as a medium, but something about this phrase just struck me as off somehow. It didn't seem consistent with how I think about fonts, the way my company has always made them. And I think it was this. I think it's the notion of fonts on the web. This to me feels like porting an old idea to a new place, which isn't really the best way forward. I think about things like this. This is the world's first bicycle. It was designed by Klaus von Drais in 1817. He called it the, oh goodness, I won't say it in German, the running machine. It was known colloquially in English as the Boneshaker, and you can see why. It's got wheels that are made of wood that are banded in iron. And remarkably, it also has no pedals, which is strange. I mean, it's sort of like Fred Flintstone using his feet to pedal the thing along. You can't imagine, I mean, what benefit you'd have to riding one of these things. It doesn't actually give you any, forward momentum. There's no, advantage of power or anything. But beyond that, it was uncomfortable. And it was actually 71 years after this first bicycle that a Scottish veterinarian whose son was a bicycle enthusiast but suffered from terrible migraines thought to actually wrap rubber tubes around the wheels and inflate them with air. We don't know much about this veterinarian's work as a veterinarian, but he is known as the father of the tire. It was John Boyd Dunlop. And so this is sort of improvement that I thought my company could bring to Webfonts most meaningfully, not to invent the bicycle, but to improve the quality of the ride so that it wasn't just for sportsmen and daredevils, but for everybody who actually wanted to get somewhere. So instead of fonts on the web, what interested us was fonts for the web. It took us a little while to figure out what this meant, and this required first answering some philosophical questions, starting with the big one, which is why do we design typefaces in the first place? I rehearse an answer to this question every November in anticipation of spending Thanksgiving dinner with my relatives, who always ask me what it is that I do, even though it's been 25 years, and I still don't really know what to tell them. I'm really at a loss. I fell in love with typography through styled letters, things like this that are really kind of evocative and fun, things that we all know from like album covers and fantasy war games and things like that. And there's nothing wrong with that, and certainly typography's history is long and rich with things that are chiefly stylistic as opposed to functional. These are some wood types from the 1860s from London, a company called W.H. Bonnewell. They're kind of a fun technical challenge in that these two pieces of wood type had to be designed to register together perfectly on press, be printed in separate colors to give you this sort of marvelous effect. And I think that's something I discovered early about type. It's the things that have a technical challenge that interest me, as well as just looking neat. Other typefaces that I love, and many typographers do, are things that are shaped by requirements that still leave ample space for personal style. This is one that many designers love. Indra is in the audience somewhere and will know what this is, but I'm betting nobody else does. This is a typeface by W.A. Dwiggins called Hingham. It's an experimental design for newsprint he never published. Every couple of years, a contemporary type designer tries to recreate this typeface, and what we all learn is just how many unusual things Dwiggins did. That lowercase o that's heaviest at the upper left corner is just kind of mystifying, or the lowercase e that's thinnest at the lower left corner. Very, very peculiar things Dwiggins did, but the end result is this sort of marvelous texture that works beautifully at small sizes. It's crazy. Here's another heavily stylized typeface. This is from 1889. It's called Arboret. It's from the Palmer and Ray foundry in San Francisco. This was made at a time when copper plate engraving was becoming very popular, steel plate engraving. This type foundry realized an opportunity to allow people who were buying printing types rather than engravings to actually recreate this kind of elaborate work. And they did this very clever thing where the end result is one giant composition of type, but of course it is made of small pieces that join together. There are these very ingenious little divisions between things, like this N and this O. And if you look at the thing carefully, you'll discover that the designer used different techniques to join each pair of letters. Each stem and vine has to end in the same place, but the designer varied where the leaves and the berries were to give it a kind of different texture. And interesting things beyond that as well. Letters like the capital A have been made more square, and the Y has been given that tail at the bottom, so they're much more filling of the space. So you're seeing more letter and less vine. It's kind of a fascinating approach. So the purpose of a typeface like this isn't just to look a certain way, it's to enable people to do a new kind of thing with type, in this case, to imitate the look of engraving. Something I always enjoy seeing in type history, and I'll get out of print into the web pretty soon, is to see the way that typefaces can inform one another but have nothing in common visually. The themes we just saw in the arboret typeface with these very cleverly managed divisions between letters are work in a typeface like this as well. This is called Original. It's from a foundry called Schriftguss in Dresden. And here, the designer is exploring the same idea, how to manage the joining of two letters that are just pieces of metal. And rather than conceal how the joins are done, he's aestheticized them. He's invented these sort of white little ribbon areas to make the gap a part of the design itself. It's really quite beautiful. And so this is sort of bringing me to my point, which is the idea that typography as a problem-solving medium can create new aesthetic opportunities as well. A final typeface I'd love to show is this. It's the Civilité, which is based on a 16th century Flemish script. It's adapted from a handwritten form in which every word ended in a long terminal stroke. This was used for official documents, and the idea was the same as the reason you write a long line on a bank check so that nobody can add extra zeros to your numbers. It would ensure that a document was completely secure. So again, in the final analysis, this typeface isn't just designed to solve a security issue in this case, but it creates a kind of new underlying aesthetic, which is really kind of marvelous. So one way to look at the question of what typefaces are for is that a good typeface is one that solves problems and does things in new ways. And I'd like to bring that around to the web via a little bit of a discussion. When I entered the industry in 1988, the Macintosh was relatively new. And I bought one based upon this ad that I saw in a magazine. It had a bunch of screenshots of pie charts and word processing and things like that. But I was fixated on this little diagram and the caption, "If you don't see a typeface you like here, Macintosh lets you design your own." I'd never seen a computer that had different kinds of typeface before, let alone different sizes and proportional spacing and all those things. I loved Macintosh, and I still do. And, but as I began to learn about type before the Mac, I started to see just how many things we'd left behind. This is a fragment from the Planten Moretus Museum in Antwerp from 1567. And I'm showing this not as an example merely of typography that I like, but of typography that was more sophisticated than we had digitally 25 years ago. It's attractive, and it's a kind of useful fossil of how typography was envisioned in the 16th century. But it's worth looking at the different strategies that the type founder came up with to articulate information. Looking in here, you see things like small capitals that mark an entry into a paragraph for readers. There are various kinds of ligatures that solve spatial problems, like the dot of the long S, the long S that obscures the dot of the I, decorative ones like the CT. And different treatments for the ends of words, terminals at the ends and swash capitals at the beginning. And as exciting as the Roman is in this typeface, the italic is even more elaborate. There's quite a bit going on here. So it was kind of a shock to go from this kind of typography in the 1500s to this 421 years later, to realize that Helvetica and PostScript had lost the expressive range, not just of the character set, no more ligatures, no more small caps, no more terminals and swashes and so on, but that we'd lost the selection as well. For the first few years of PostScript, these were the only typefaces that existed, and these came with the LaserWriter. None of them is particularly appealing to me or very exciting. And to give you a sense of the scope of typographic invention that preceded the computer, this is the library in our office, and these are all books on type. By some estimates, there were more than 200,000 typefaces designed before the advent of digital composition, and most of them are lost. New digital fonts had small families as well. They were arbitrarily fixed on bold, italic, and their product bold italic. And it was in response to the status quo that I designed a typeface for Apple called Hepler Text, which was commissioned in 1991. Hepler Text was designed to extend the character set from this base foundation of ASCII, Latin 1, and foresee more sophisticated situations. So in addition to the lining figures and these two ligatures, we would have old-style figures for the lowercase and an extended ligature set. The ligature set actually extended far beyond things you'd find in most Western typography to more unusual pairs. there was a surfing enthusiast on the team who kept pointing out the word surfboard needed an FB ligature, so we had to do one of those. And so on. There are swashes and decorative ligatures and so on. I feel like once you've solved the genuine design problem, you've earned the right to decorate things as well. So the idea behind the typeface and a technology called TrueType GX that Apple was developing was that the font would know its context. It would know which size $sign to use based upon the context of small caps or lowercase or old style figures and so on. And it would satisfy a broader community of users than just Americans and Western Europeans. We took the opportunity to restore some traditions from typography that I liked, like swash caps and terminals and alternates and so on, and to invent some new ones as well. Italic small capitals haven't really had a place in typography classically. Engraved capitals were a typographic nicety, was worth adding as well. Arabesque borders, things kind of spiraled out of control, as you can imagine, over the course of years of development. So the idea behind this typeface was not just to make a new font, but a new kind of font, a font that offered designers new kinds of things to work with, new flavors for articulating information and new choices in terms of how the family was arranged. And that became a kind of hallmark of the work that I did at the company. This is a typeface called Ditto. It was designed for Harper's Bazaar in 1991. And I mention it here not just because it's a piece of work that I'm proud of, but because it is designed to respond to the size at which it's used, which was kind of a new thing in digital type way back then. There's a delicate variant for headlines, a robust one for text, and 5 steps in between. And you can see as you compare the large size font and the one meant for small sizes, how many things change. The weight of the hairlines, the proportion of the lowercase, the details like the size of the trademark symbol, and so on. The end result of that project was this massive family of 42 styles, which I think, by the way, they felt they needed to use all of on this one page because they paid for them all. And this concept had become very important 20 years later for web fonts, the idea that fonts are designed for one size or one set of sizes. Another kind of hallmark of work that I began doing involved how typefaces can solve workflow problems. This is a family called Knockout we designed for Sports Illustrated. And Knockout was designed not just to be a new and nice typeface, but to solve a problem that designers had. Typically, the designers at Sports Illustrated would get all the text in an article first, but the headlines last. And they'd be sitting waiting until 2 in the morning for some editor to write the headline. Invariably, the headline would come in, it wouldn't fit, and the editor would leave for the night. And what we decided to do then is to do a family of typefaces that could solve the problem by having different varieties in width to always fit the grid. So you could choose not the one typeface that's used here, but the next narrowest one, solve the problem. You could also go home. So really for me, this meant allowing art directors and designers to spend more time focusing on design and less time focusing on typographic problem solving. I think that fonts can really do a lot more to help people focus on the big picture things than dealing with the minutiae of ligatures and copy fit and so on. Sports Illustrated has made some very clever uses of Knockout that I've always liked. This was the best-selling issue in the year 2000. It was the 50 greatest sports figures from Texas. And what's kind of marvelous about this is they did a similar issue for every state in the union. They printed the same magazine, but changed the cover and an 8-page insert inside. Kind of a sinister thing to do, but kind of clever as well. But what's sort of marvelous about this to me is they were able to leverage all the effort going into designing the elaborate surroundings of this and just change out the font based upon the length of the state name. I was happy to see this idea of fonts in different widths helping solve more small problems as well as large painterly ones like that. This is a chart from inside the magazine. I don't know who designed it, just came across this randomly. But I was happy to see that whoever laid this out noticed that the word Buccaneers wouldn't quite fit. They dropped down to the next narrowest typeface. But my final slide of Knockout is this, that I passed this morning, actually right outside the, on Friedrichstrasse. Happy to see that other designers have realized that this is how the typeface is meant to be used, that there are different widths for different kinds of copy lengths. So the idea of a typeface that solves problems and saves resources, whether it's paper or time or something, is a theme that I think is worth continuing from print into the web. This is a typeface called Mercury Text, which we designed for the New Times newspaper chain in the late 90s. Mercury was designed to be foremost space efficient. It had to pack as many words in as possible without looking like it was cramped. And what we discovered working on this is just how many things you need to do and you have an opportunity to do when working in an environment like newsprint. You discover things like, if this is the end result, and this is a scan of the end product, you need to do curious things to the outlines themselves to achieve the result you want. Comparing these side by side, you'll see things like that little branch in the center of the capital K vanishes on press. And so in this way, you can really think of a typeface not as an end product, but as a kind of scaffolding that helps you get toward your end product. The end product exists only on paper, not as a digital outline to a reader. We took a lot of newspaper projects on back then because newsprint offered some interesting challenges in terms of design, in terms of workflow. One of the more curious ones that was part of this project was this newspaper chain had 17 papers in different American markets, and we discovered things like, well, first of all, they shared content. They would pull the same AP wire service story and run it in all the different newspapers. So the idea is using the same typeface and the same grid, they wouldn't have to relay out each paper. But we discovered things like this. The paper in Denver looked very kind of thin and anemic, and the type in the one in Miami was very heavy. And that's because Denver is a very dry city at a high altitude, and Miami is a very damp one at sea level. So the solution was to actually reform each outline for each newspaper based upon its climate. So the Denver typeface is thicker, the Miami typeface is thinner, so it will actually bloom into the ink and paper. And of course, all the typefaces share the same set of widths, so there are no copy fit changes as you move from one font to the next. So this font really achieves two things. It uses a media strategy to help ensure that the quality of the results is what you want, and it takes on a workflow issue to help people save time. They're not dealing with color changes on press or making sure that the typeface looks the way they want to on the screen. They're able to rely upon what the typeface has been built to do. So with this little sampling of projects we've done in the past, which we wanted to bring to the web in some way, we began thinking about what the themes are in the work that we do and what makes a typeface successful both to design and to use. And what we realized is that a typeface is indeed one that solves problems, ideally many problems at once. Perhaps it's one that tries to do more, to give authors a bigger expressive range of styles to work with. Perhaps it's designed to encourage reading, a typeface like OurDo that very clearly invites the reader in by making the headlines look like headlines and the text behave like text. Maybe it saves time, like Knockout, helping designers focus on things besides typography and instead upon their stories. Or maybe it saves resources, like Mercury. And resources, while they've always meant in the past ink and paper, they also mean effort. It means the ability to take advantage of economies of scale, like content sharing, or for that matter, download time. A small file is more resource efficient than a large file. So instead of talking about fonts on the web, we began looking for is how fonts for the web could solve problems, which meant asking what are the problems on the web. So one of the principal things that I think web fonts can do better is to address clarity. We are now in kind of web fonts middle period where the work has gotten much better than it was in its infancy, but still most fonts in the browser aren't clear, especially at small sizes and especially on Windows. This is what many web fonts look like in the browser. These are fonts that might look okay on some circumstances on some platforms, but they mostly don't. They're mostly difficult to read. They're not inviting to read, certainly. And they're fonts that are eroded by the effects of the bitmap grid, a problem that worsens when you move from the Mac to Windows. And it's troubling to me that it's at text sizes where web fonts are at their weakest because text reader read the most. Developers have been getting around this by avoiding text, using web fonts only for headlines, or allowing text sizes to inch up from 12 pixels to 16 to 20. But I kind of feel like we should be able to do things on the screen that we can do in print. And even 4 or 5 years into this web font revolution, it feels like it's still the case that web fonts are used more by personal sites than by ones that carry an important social or commercial mission. Not enough news outlets use web fonts, not enough banks or airlines, municipal services. And in my experience, working with these kinds of organizations, it's because this is what they expect from web fonts. They expect a compromise in some way. And that, of course, is because these aren't web fonts at all. These are print fonts on the web. They're like Von Drace's bicycle, which had wooden carriage wheels, because they were the only wheels that Von Drace ever knew. So a common problem is weight. Fonts can look too heavy or too light. There are also fonts that disintegrate because so many of their parts are smaller than 1 pixel. It's a problem that affects the identity of letters beyond their look. It's very hard to tell the O from the E in this typeface at this small size. Thickening the hairlines doesn't necessarily solve the problem. This is a reliable print face shown on the web at 13 pixels, where the C and the E become ambiguous. Not really acceptable either. And it's a matter of relative scale. Punctuation marks like these are very vulnerable to what happens in the web, and a print font on screen will yield these little smudges that are sort of indistinguishable. So in thinking about what could change about a letter to make it better fit the screen, we tried everything and discovered it can actually change quite a lot. You can change the weight of a letter. You can ensure that it's neither too brittle nor too heavy. You can change its proportions to favor important details that help identify what a letter is meant to look like. You can even change things like the angle of an italic, and no one ever notices. In the background here is a print font. On the foreground is a variant made for the web. We changed the italic angle here so that it would intersect pixels at even intervals. And you can even change the morphology of a letter altogether. You can replace a two-story G with a single-story G, so it's clearer at small sizes. And again, the question is how much you can adapt before anybody begins to notice, and the answer is almost everything. No one ever notices the adjustments we make from a print font like this to a web font like this, because of course, outside of this conference and this slide, you never see these things side by side like this. In the real world, you might see an iPad on the left and a piece of paper on the right, in which each environment looks correct. The typeface is designed for print or designed for the screen, and it feels like itself. It's sort of like the Mercury typeface, where nobody ever sees that crossbar on the K. It's really designed to take the brunt of the ink and the paper. So you can think of design of a web font as a kind of, again, a scaffolding that disappears once the thing is actually produced. So this is a key thing about how we think about web fonts as part of our cloud typography service, not just as proxies for print typefaces, but as new creations that are designed to be fitted to their medium. And I keep returning to print, not because I think it's a paragon of good design, but because I think it establishes a benchmark, a standard that I think we can all shoot for. Print is a place where typography got it right, and I think the screen can be as well. By the way, in case you're wondering, this really isn't a mock-up. This is a genuine thing with the high-tech tape and whatever. So my Gen 1 iPad serves as the office. So I promised you a list of the important things to consider when choosing a web font, and I think the first one is size. What we've decided to do is to rename all of our typefaces multi-purpose typefaces, which means they're ideal for high-resolution environments like print and headlines on the web, but for small sizes to create new typefaces called screen smarts. And screen smart typefaces are the ones that benefit from all those changes to proportion and weight and fit and color and so on, with an additional layer of engineering for the screen. These fonts are intended for use between 9 and 18 pixels, a place where we think web fonts should be their best, not their worst. We got there by redesigning our entire library using tools we largely built in-house. This is a marvelous tool that Andy Clymer built at our office that is built on top of the WebKit framework, so we can actually draw outlines and experience the result immediately in a Safari window. I thought it'd be useful to shape the typefaces in the same place people would be experiencing them, rather than have this separate workflow of designing here and proofing here. While text these days might mean 13, 16, 20 pixels, we began everything with the worst case scenario of 9 pixels, which I still think is a useful benchmark. This is Gotham Screen Smart in the browser. Traditionally, you think of typeface design as happening at the scale of a letter. You draw a giant glyph and go to the next glyph and so on, but it really happens at the scale of the paragraph. Everything you do is thought of in terms of its end result in text. We use the tools we built to be able to actually make massive changes throughout a paragraph at once, rather than just focusing on one letter at a time. A discovery early on was that while I think as people who work on screen, we think of the pixel as the kind of atom of the web, you can really make a lot of profound change to typeface looking at a level much smaller than a pixel. This is what happens when you add 1/25th of a pixel to each side of each character here. It sounds kind of subatomically small, but take a look. And here's another 1/25th of a pixel. Oops, no, just that one. It's a small change, but it adds up. It adds, well, there are 50 characters per line in this paragraph, so expanding each character's spacing by 1/25th of a pixel gives you 18 pixels over the course of the paragraph, enough to shift one word down to the final line. We also thought that in designing typefaces, comparisons to fallbacks were important. This is Georgia on the bottom, one of the best web fonts. This is Sentinel ScreenSmart on top that we developed alongside Georgia. I kind of felt that unless we could do things that are as good as the best fonts on the web, why bother? To say that your typeface isn't as good as Verdana or isn't as good as Arial, it just seems like a disappointment. And part of this approach involved focusing on worst-case typefaces, taking the darkest and most condensed and smallest typefaces to ensure that they would work. This is Gotham ScreenSmart Black on Windows at 12 pixels. This is Gotham's extra narrow black ScreenSmart at 13 pixels. The result is that the more daunting typefaces, if they can be made to look good, the more manageable ones can be made to look outstanding, and that their personality can really shine through. This is a typeface called Ideal Sans that has no straight lines. It's entirely asymmetrical and entirely curved, but has been kind of reckoned with the pixel grid to carry its personality as much as possible onto the web. Anyway, it's amazing to kind of see how far things have come from where they all began. So clarity, I think, is the first thing to look for in anybody's web fonts, and it's certainly been a target for us in the work we've been doing. But another thing that's worth focusing on, and is largely ignored, are font families, which need to be more useful on the web. A contemporary family like this has really informed designers what they should expect. In this case, we have 4 widths and 8 weights, and they're italics as well. And compared with this, it's kind of clear that most web fonts just don't have enough weights. We're still used to the family that has the 4 styles, the Roman, the italic, the bold italic, even among things designed for the screen. And there's a good reason for this. All of the core web fonts we've grown up with were designed at a time when screens had 1-bit resolution. Pixels were either on or off. And this is the reason that looking at Arial and Arial Bold, the Bold has stems that are 2 pixels wide, and Arial has stems that are 1 pixel wide. Those are your 2 options. And this is a fine approach back in 1992, but modern operating systems all feature anti-aliasing, which lets us look at things not as just on or off, but as partially on, leading to much finer control of the weight of a web font. But this makes its own problems. In addition to not enough weights, we now have indistinct weights. Looking at Arial again, this was okay 22 years ago, but now we get this. These same outlines rendered in grayscale are hard to tell apart from each other. There's no semantic jump between Roman and bold that we need as designers. And this is a condition that affects a lot of the fonts you see on the web. This is a popular font I see a lot online that comes in 6 weights. And take a look and you'll see that there are some odd things happening as you just track down the weights from top to bottom. Looking at these 2, you can see that the weight on the bottom doesn't really feel heavier than the weight on top. They're almost the same weight. And down here, I think the weight on the bottom feels lighter than the weight on top. So in addition to the problem of not enough weights, we have the problem of indistinct weights, and now the problem of disordered weights. I've been trying to find a way to kind of diagram what should happen in a font family, and the best I can do is this thing I think I'm calling the highly scientific weightometer, which is meant to tell you what happens between lightest and boldest in a font. The idea is as the weights progress from light to bold, they should actually get bolder and bolder. A family like this, you find begins light and begins to meander. It gets heavier and then lighter again, much heavier, lighter, and then heavier still. Not necessarily a defect in the underlying design that was created for print, but really a problem for the web. So one thing that we advocate, and we've been happy to see other foundries doing this as well, is to uncouple the way that web font weights work from print fonts. Not to feel beholden to an existing family structure if you can actually do more or do things more efficiently or more effectively on the web. We felt that we had the freedom as designers to relocate fonts along their weight spectrum, not to say we're going to slavishly make all 8 weights that Gotham comes in, but we're going to do 6. We're going to push the distance between things apart as much as possible, so that there's always a semantically clear step from one weight to the next. This is Gotham ScreenSmart in 13 point on Windows. And here's the entire family with its corresponding font weight values. And so we made this condition of all of our ScreenSmart fonts, that every weight should be not just distinctive, but useful. Everything belongs in the family. It feels like it's appropriate to its milieu on the screen. So this is Sentinel on the left and Whitney on the right, and each is designed to provide a unique color in every style, from light to black. Occasionally you find things like a web font can be more expressive than a print font. This is Mercury Text, which in print has 3 styles, on the web has 4. So a final challenge having to do with font families has to do with font families that don't have weights at all. I mentioned Knockout before. CSS provides for things like the font style descriptor for things that are Roman or italic, and font weight for things that range in weight. There's even a font width descriptor, although it's not widely supported. But Knockout doesn't really have in its 32 styles any kind of Roman to bold relationship. It has this pile of things that you want to use, but no clear relationships that are expressible in CSS. Typefaces like this are even stranger. This is Nitro, a typeface we designed for the New York Jets under Michael Beirut at Pentagram. When it was finished, I began thinking about what else we could do to make it interesting as a family, and we decided to do a backslant for it called Turbo. I've yet to see this used out in the world, by the way. But if anybody's doing like muscle cars or batteries and things, that'd probably be a good choice. CSS doesn't have a way to articulate that these typefaces are part of the same family, but are both italic in different directions. And certainly as families get more and more anarchic, there's simply nothing you can do. This is a package called Numbers. It has 16 fonts, all of which are related by being numbers, but have nothing formally in common at all. And I think the underlying problem here is that CSS, like Unicode and many other kind of prescriptive things that are meant to bring order to the chaos of typography, are somebody's idea about expectations, about preparing for what exists today. Type designers want to do something else. They always want to create new kinds of typefaces that break the system in some way. So it's really a challenge to bring these things into highly structured technological environments like CSS. So I mentioned clarity and font families as 2 things to look for in web fonts. I think a final thing that designers should look for are all of the font's features. I think the designers I work with probably stand apart from a lot of people involved in web fonts these days, in that we don't think of fonts features are discretionary. They're not really a progressive enhancement. They're a core part of what the typeface is about. And you can, I think, defend that position looking at some things in the everyday world where complex typographic palettes have helped designers articulate information in interesting ways. This is my dictionary that I grew up with. And if you look around, you'll see a lot of different typographic things going on here. Different typefaces have been used and different styles have been used to articulate things like definitions, parts of speech. There's a slab serif used for all the head words. There are IPA symbols for pronunciation guides, special punctuation for etymologies, foreign characters, and so on. So why shouldn't a printed dictionary's digital successor, which is in every way superior, like Wikipedia, not have the same kinds of features? Why shouldn't it be as articulate and as expressive and frankly as beautiful as a dictionary can be on paper? It's as if, having lost the need to pack the maximum amount of information to every inch, we've forgotten how useful type can be in articulating information. And to me, that makes the medium really less rich as well as less engaging. This is a marvelous example of typographic features at work. This is a typeface, well, this is some lettering on copperplate engravings that we adapted to a typeface called Surveyor earlier this year. And I find this beautiful, but I also find it to be a fascinating example of user interface work in print. It uses a very complex vocabulary, different kinds of lettering to distinguish between towns and counties and rivers and so on. There's a great moment here where a Roman ruin has been picked out using a black letter typeface. I think that's really kind of charming. And the idea was that as a map user, you'd quickly become accustomed to these things and know that this is the purpose of this kind of lettering. And of course, there's always a chart in the back telling you what's used where. So sophisticated typographic systems like these are designed to educate their users. They are a UI for typography, for content that educates you along the way. And if it also delights and entertains us, why not all the better? I realize that digital presentation uses different techniques to communicate. The fact that a digital map, you can zoom in and out, you can change resolution, you can change the content that's shown, makes it much more superior. But I think with the right fonts, much more is possible. So when we began thinking about web fonts, we began thinking about, as a minimum requirement, offering everything on the web that designers have in print. And that really meant building our own service to take advantage of these things. We felt that all fonts should have small caps. ones that work everywhere, not just in the latest OpenType supporting browsers, but also in IE6. Swashes, which I'm personally fond of. It's up to a designer to choose whether to deploy these decoratively or semantically, but either way, we felt it should be up to the designer to choose. And we didn't see any reasons why designers shouldn't be able to do things online that they can do on paper. Things with multiple figure sets and fractions and small caps and superiors and all little graphic forms we add to our typefaces that really help convey information. And what this comes down to for me, I think, is that we think of the web app that delivers a font as being an extension of the font itself. This is one tool designed to do one thing. It begins with letter forms, but it ends with how they're actually deployed. So I wanted to show you a little bit about what's inside Cloud Typography's UI that's meant to answer some of these things specifically. We, of course, take advantage of all the CSS descriptors that are universally supported, things like font weight for a family like this that has weights from 200 to 800. But for families that are more unpredictable, we've tried to preserve the same UI so we can think about things as the same kinds of objects, but deploy them differently. This is the landmark family, which has 4 styles in its family. They don't follow a range of weights. They're all just different decorative variations. So it's presented in the UI as the same way, but each has its own font family descriptor. So there's a lot of work happening on the back end to ensure that each typeface can be served the right way to keep developers from having to improvise workarounds for strange things. I talked about a font's features before, and that's something we put a lot of thought into as well. We wanted to make sure that designers could each manage each family not only as a list of styles, where things can be checked off and on, but also have the option to change the character set. You can decide as a user to restrict or alter different parts of a character set, to decide what kinds of capital letters to deliver, regular ones or swashes, whether the lowercase should be lowercase or small caps, what kinds of figures to deliver as well. And the idea is in choosing this typeface, you can then say, I want not lining figures, but short-ranging figures, and commit those to the project. And of course, each typeface has its own set of options. Sentinel may have those things, but Whitney has things that are different altogether. It's got old-style figures and tabular figures, as well as more parts of the character set, Greeks, Cyrillics, fractions, scientific symbols, and so on. So our goal isn't to be to prescribe what's in a typeface, but to allow the typeface to inform the UI, to say, this is what I have, share this with the user. So Sentinel might have lining figures to go with the capitals and short-ranging figures to go with the lowercase. Whitney has these as well as tabular figures that are designed for charts and tables. Verilog has these plus something called short-lining figures, which are all the same height, but designed at a size to sympathize with lowercase more. And so as a user, you can decide what you want. You can decide to serve lining figures, or in this case, this is tabular figures from one typeface on the left and old-style figures from another on the right. We've had the opportunity in our site to begin deploying some of the odder things in a typeface, like the fractions in Mercury that go to 1/40,000 for some reason. And this is a lot of what type design is. It's trying to think about how things might be used and to plan for those in advance. So of course the swashes are in there, as I mentioned before, and small caps as well. And here they are in text sizes. I've been enjoying seeing small caps used, not just for introductions, like in that 16th century page I showed, but as a replacement for all caps in text. That's a classic thing to do in print, and it's making an appearance online more and more. And here's some more of the depth of Whitney's character set showing up. These are some pre-revolutionary Russian Cyrillic characters that vanished in around 1917. So in the spring, when Mark and I last met, and he invited me to speak here, I mentioned that we were working on a new feature for the site that I thought I might share, but I cautioned him that it was pretty obscure, and maybe only the most hardcore typophile developers would care about it, but he encouraged me to present it nonetheless. So here it is today. It's a new thing we're rolling out this week. I want to take a second to thank the folks on my team who worked on this. Susan, Brandon, Reed, Andy, Brian, Tom, Jimmy, and Anisha got behind this with an incredible zeal, given how esoteric it is, as you're about to see. Here's how it works. I mentioned that for every font family, you can control the style list, turning styles on and off. And you can control the character set as well, choosing what kinds of characters to invoke. We've added a third thing for an OpenType feature called stylistic sets. Stylistic sets are an underused feature in OpenType that allow a type designer to gather all kinds of alternate characters and other kinds of changes into a single decision. They're supported in InDesign, but not really many other places, not in Illustrator, for example. We're pleased to bring it to the web with Cloud Typography. And here's how it works. You can, for every family, see what kinds of sets the designer has chosen going in. There might be things like, in the Archer family, an option for a straight-tailed Q, and checking this off will replace all the Qs in the typeface from this sort of pipe-like tail to a more straight one. And this will replace the Q in the capital and small capital forms and across all 16 weights. We type designers like to use stylistic sets for different kinds of things, some of them functional, some of them decorative. But I wanted to leave you an example that uses things in a way that's kind of both functional and stylistic. This is the landmark typeface that I mentioned earlier. It's one of our more colorful things. If you find yourself designing a piece of typography like this, you might want to address some of the small, funny details in the design with things that are now handled in stylistic sets. You might find that the umlaut that sits above the cap line is distracting, and happily there's now an option to turn on compact umlauts in this typeface that will drop these down to under the cap height. Again, huge burning issue that I know you all are delighted to have. But it gets better, because if you're doing things in German and Danish side by side, which so many websites are, you can also retract the slashes on the O slash to inside the character with this little feature, the non-projecting O slash. I did warn you, Mark, it was going to be pretty geeky. So yes, check that off, and there that goes. The A ring also, you can do the same thing. Find the option for that. Lowered A rings. Check it off. And finally, the punctuation. The colons by the 9 and 15 are a little bit too low, so checking off the raised colon option will lift those up incredibly slightly, probably too small to even see at a distance. So anyway, if you are indeed doing cross-German-Danish website design for fictitious furniture stores in Copenhagen, we have the answer for you today. Please find me afterwards if I can be of any assistance here. We'll have some more practical examples on the website when I get home. So I wanted to close in my last couple of minutes showing you some things that folks have been doing with cloud typography. If you follow me on Twitter, you know that I had a mild freak out in the spring of 2011. I was on vacation with my wife in Mexico, and I saw on Twitter that we had launched Webfonts. And we had not launched Webfonts. But one of our clients decided to launch Webfonts without telling us. This is the President of the United States, who is using Gotham and Sentinel, and this is the website built for Obama for America by Blue State Digital. They were the first, they were client number 1 in our Webfont beta, and they just decided to roll it out one day without telling anybody. So we got 11 million hits in the first 10 minutes, and a good kind of trial by fire to make sure things worked. But they did a great job, and they're using the fonts even to this day. They did a nice thing, which is to use the ScreenSmart fonts for text sizes and the multi-purpose fonts for headline sizes, so everything really looks correct at the right scale. This is a nice site that's an homage to City Bike, New York City's new free biking program. Zach Davenport and Michael Yap made this, and I can't really capture everything the site does on this presentation, but it's worth taking a look at. They do a nice job of having these very complex infographics that use type in a very kind of tender way. They also use almost the entire Verilog family. There's a condensed, a compressed, a regular width, 5 weights, italics. It's all in there at various times. Treehouse, I discovered last week, uses Gotham Rounded and Gotham Rounded ScreenSmart for small sizes. It's something I like to see isn't just home pages that do big kind of painterly things, but also the back end of a website. They use these things for their forums, their FAQs, and stuff like that. This is a neat web app called Depot. We use our tungsten typeface, not just on the website, but for their mobile tools as well, which is really nice. A lot of small businesses also are using web fonts to really leverage things in useful ways. This is a great site built by an agency in Ontario called They Inspire. The client is Purcell Heliskiing, a helicopter skiing extreme sport thing that it just sounds so scary to me that I haven't really investigated what it really means. But the site is really beautiful, and they've given the fonts an incredibly thorough workout. They're using 3 families, Tungsten, Sentinel, and Gotham. That's Gotham on the right for the big temperature, and below it, Gotham Screen Smart for all the data points below it. If you've worked cross-platform, which I assume you do if you're a developer, you've no doubt run into the challenge of how to display type on the Mac and Windows the same way to give things the same color and texture. These guys really did it perfectly. It's one of the best sites I've ever seen. The display type is always smooth, the text is always crisp. And just for comparison, that's the Mac on the left and Windows on the right. I realize it's hard to see tiny pixels at this scale, but it's an impressive thing to see in person, so check it out. An especially nice thing is you've all run into the challenge of dropping type out of a dark color, where the type always seems to kind of blob up. They've managed to make that work as well. Again, Windows now on the right, Mac on the left, all looking correct. And I thought I'd leave you with OurDo that redesigned last summer using our Webfonts. They use the Whitney family and the Whitney Screen Smart family on their throughout their everything, print, web, mobile. I think OurDo does a great job of using typography for all the different media they serve. And I chose to end with this for the very strange reason that when I signed up for OurDo to take these slides, the first album it recommended to me was something called Small Fonts by the Capitals. So I felt it was fate. Thank you all so much.